Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this webinar where we are going to talk about how the shipping emissions regulation, where we are today, and where the industry is heading. I am so lucky to have three very insightful panelists joining me. Andreas Gaardsdal from NORDEN, Harris Petousis from Seamar, and Joe Bettles from the Mærsk Mc-Kinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. I think all of us are spending time daily working with some element of the shipping emissions regulation, whether it's in terms of reporting, whether it's in terms of optimizing, or whether it's in terms of adjusting them and giving inputs for the future. We all have our insights to share with you guys today. And with that, I would like to briefly allow the panelists to introduce themselves. And I think we should start with the commercial insights. So I will be heading off with Andreas. Andreas, the Senior Market Risk Analyst at NORDEN. He's a guy who turns the regulations into something commercially acceptable at NORDEN. And please give a few words on what you do at NORDEN and how you've been working with regulations.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan. As mentioned, I'm Andreas Gaardsdal. I'm a Senior Market Risk Analyst here in NORDEN, one of the largest owner-operators in the world with around 450 to 500 vessels at any given point in time. I've been working for the past couple of years more or less exclusively with FuelEU and EU ETS, where my main focus has been on creating these more complex regulations and trying to make them actionable, trying to get the commercials teams to drive great results, try to get the right clauses in place, and try to optimizing both the tactics and the strategies that we try to turn this regulation not into something cumbersome, but also an opportunity. So this is what I'm spending most of my time with, is this commerciality of the regulation, as well on the side, also on the operational side of the regulation, trying to actually get the biofuel on the vessels, try to find the most optimal vessels on the most optimal voyages, where we want to burn this amount of biofuel, or in more or less like create compliance with these different regulations. So this is the experience that I bring to the table, is more on the commercial side of the things, where I'm spending a lot of time with the trading teams and trying to optimize on how we can implement this regulation across the board.
Thanks for that intro, Andreas. From the commercial side, we are heading down to the engine room and to the technical part of it. Harris, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me in this very insightful panel. My name is Harris Petousis. I work for the Seamar Management SA as the performance manager of the company. We are part of the Pangea Logistics Group, which is based in the US and is the NASDAQ listed company, having a large list of vessels of bulk carriers and also chartering a few more. I deal with the daily performance of the vessels, and of course monitor all the regulatory framework regarding the emissions and the consumptions, like ETS, FuelEU, and everything we're going to discuss today. I will try to provide some technical insights in the discussion and assist the conversation towards the commercial part and the regulatory part of the other colleagues here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harris. And then over to the high-level view of regulations. That's you, Joe. You have worked with you're the Climate Policy and Analysis Manager at Zero Carbon Shipping Center. And I know you also been working, I don't know if it's for EU or together in drafting recommendations towards EU to comply with these things. So I'm certain that you will have a lot of insights to share with us on how this works.
Yeah, thanks. Sometimes I'm confused on whether I'm working for or with or against them myself. No, my name is Joe. Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, BS Group for having me today. And my focus, like the other gentlemen on this call, has been on the EU framework, the Fit for 55 package, which has certainly kept us busy, as well as the IMO Net Zero framework. And if you were to sum up the work that I'm doing, it's to address the lack of clarity and lack of certainty in regulations. So where there are certain facts within the regulation that are perhaps difficult for the industry to understand or analyze, then we try to provide clarity. And to the extent where there is some missing piece that we would like the regulator to provide more certainty around, that there isn't an answer that can be found, then we work with regulators. And this will, of course, become very important for the development of guidelines, because right now, as we will talk about, the Net Zero framework is a pretty just a foundation of a policy, and many of the details will be forthcoming. So thanks.
Thank you, Joe. We've divided this webinar into 5 main topics, where we'll cover everything from the ECA zones, which has recently been expanding with the Mediterranean. We'll talk about the EU ETS, how that carbon pricing market is affecting shipping now, and how we see that impacting both in terms of combining with the future IMO regulation, but also in terms of how it will affect this trading of ships going forward. From there, we'll move to the FuelEU. This is something that is probably on the agenda at many of our desks, but also on the audience here. We'll take a look at the IMO GFI. Even though it's not fully voted through, we have a pretty good idea of the framework coming into place. And finally, we'll look ahead and discuss how we see in general these new and increased regulations shaping the industry going forward. So with no further ado, let's start with what came first. That was the ECA zones. The Baltic area got a sulfur cap almost a decade ago. This meant that trading in the Baltic was required a different fuel type than what the industry was used to. And we now see that being expanded first with the Mediterranean, but also during the MEPC 83, that the North Sea will also become an ECA zone in 2028, if I'm not mistaken. But since we have a technical guy with us, I'd like to ask you, Harris, with the increasing or the expansion of these ECA zones, it leaves owners and operators with limited options in terms of fuels. Either you need to go for a more low sulfur fuel, so that could be a MGO or also low sulfur fuel, or you can use scrubbers. How do you, as the technical guy here, do you have any experience in terms of what this means for the handling on board, for the tank capacity, etc.? And how do you see and further expansion affecting especially the dry bulk?
Thank you, Stefan, for the question. First of all, we should mention that this introduction of the new ECA has been quite smoother compared to the previous sulfur cap, let's say, of 2020, because the infrastructure in the area was much easier to comply with the requirements of the area. Like, we had all these major hubs like Gibraltar, Algeciras, and the major ports in Med that could assist any choice, any banking procurement with regards to the MGO, as you said, or ultra low sulfur fuel oil, or even biofuels. So the compliance in the area was quite easy. For us, our vessels are not equipped with scrubbers. So at the end of the day, we had to adjust our operational and technical procedures in order to meet better results. ULSFO has been proven quite a good economical option compared to the MGO in the area, which also offers a compliance of the sulfur limit at a lower purchasing cost. Now, with regards to the day-to-day operation, of course, the new ECA has added additional compliance cost. If we imagine that the vessel requires approximately let's say, depending on the speed, 4 to 6 days maybe to transit the Med. We can imagine that the additional cost of the MGO or the biofuel or the ULSFO, instead of the standard fossil fuel of the VLSFO, has increased the daily operational cost and the voyage economics. And it sometimes comes with some technical measures that we need to follow. For example, for the ULSFO, we need to carefully investigate which vessel can undertake and accommodate this product and take all the necessary precautions. In our case, we performed the technical assessment for the storage and the technical capabilities of every vessel, checking the heating oils, checking the storage tanks, and mitigate all the potential risks that we could have on the vessel. So it's a case-by-case situation, specifically for the ULSFO. The MGO comes with other kind of technical precautions that we should take, but it's much easier to be handled. Of course, we should also check the fuel system equipment, the filtering equipment, and how much time is required to maintain the ULSFO on board. Obviously, before taking any ULSFO on board, the bunkering plan should be amended because the tanks are recommended to be stripped down to minimum levels, so we can avoid commingling and any compatibility issues with other fuels that might exist. So this new MEDECA zone has created this issue as well. The vessels need to have a proper, let's say, fuel segregation on board, having both ECA-compliant and non-compliant fuels in case that the vessel transits the Med. That's it.
All right, but in general, you haven't seen a big issue in the switchover. It's more of a planning issue rather than a technical amendment issue. You haven't done a lot of modifications on board your ships to be able to comply with this new ECA zone.
In terms of the ULSFO consumption, as we said, we need to assess every vessel. We don't have to do any modification unless we change the tank orientation. But other than that, we just have to increase the maintenance intervals of the filtering equipment, of the purification equipment, and ensure that the temperatures and all the guidelines are followed on board. So for this kind of products, to ensure that the main engine and the rest of the engines, the generators, are maintained in good condition. It's all about handling.
Yeah, but as you also mentioned, there's a lot of planning going into this. And we've been in NORDEN, we even had some cases where we had maybe some improper handling of or planning of these cases, where we suddenly find ourselves in a position where we do not have sufficient MGO to actually transit the Mediterranean. And that's when we start thinking, well, what to do now? Either we have to go into some serious planning, either, for instance, call multiple bunkering ports around Med in order to maybe have sufficient, or there's also now the alternative of biofuel, because one of the great parts about this biofuel that we can get is that, well, once that Mediterranean turns into an ECA area, the biofuel premium becomes much, much smaller. I mean, we're not anymore comparing biofuel prices to VLSFO prices. Now we are comparing for all of the transit period that we have in the Mediterranean. Now the price gap is much, much smaller. And there's also then the upside that the biofuel is not necessarily going into the MGO tanks. They can also go into the other tanks. So suddenly we have a very wide array where it's actually more optimal to burn the biofuel in the Mediterranean area, because not only do we have a smaller price, but we also, of course, generate the savings in terms of the EU ETS, and of course also generate the compliance for FuelEU. So in some ways, yes, this is a huge planning that goes into this for a fleet in general, but there is actually improves the ability to operationalize, to optimize, your operations regarding your switch to biofuel, if you can get more of this biofuel consumption going on in the Med.
And adding to that, Andreas, is that then the case for a blended product or more of the B100 pure biofuel that you then use in this?
Yeah, I mean, most of the blended products will not be able to comply with the new regulations, new SECA regulations down there. So this is actually mainly an upside for the 100% pure biofuel, where we see that when we have Gibraltar as a biofuel hub, subject to availability, of course, then there is some upside in bunkering this biofuel actually when we are going into the Med. It takes a couple of days, of course, to get the biofuel sample analysis before we can start burning it. But once we have this biofuel results, then burning the pure biofuel within the Med has a much higher upside compared to doing it west of the Straits of Gibraltar.
And now we're talking B100. I'd like to turn the question back to you, Harris. Have you done any testing on these high grades of biofuels at Seamar?
Yes, we have done a few in the past. But now we, of course, enhance the biofuel consumption at any point. Our information from our laboratories and the ROs, the classification societies, have shown that there are not many issues when the bio comes into consumption. So it's in the plan to proceed with more bios in the future.
All right, thank you. And I pre-sent some of the questions to the panelists here, and Joe, he came back and said he knew nothing about the ECA zone, so I tried to curve the question a little bit so it might be down your alley. In policy, working with emission regulation in shipping, I know you're talking a lot of the greenhouse gases. Sulfur is, of course, something that has been highly focused. It was one of the earlier issues of pollutants that we saw in the shipping industry that was taken action upon. Is that still part of the discussions when we are shaping these future regulations, or are you mainly just focusing on the greenhouse gas?
Well, first, thanks for the humbling introduction there. But it's good to be honest about what we don't know. Actually, this is very interesting, and Andreas's point around the cost gap for Mediterranean, and then I guess also looking to the future, the North Sea, that we'll be looking at bio versus MDO, MGO. That is really interesting. So I have learned something that's very relevant. And yeah, at the center, our focus is decarbonization, not to the exclusion of other air pollutants, but we are primarily focused on of carbon and nitrous oxide. So that does mean that sulfur is so far a little bit outside of our scope. So do I see this playing a role? Yeah, I mean, I think air pollution has always been a big driver of decarbonization, I would say, across sectors. As a benefit. Of course, now we're looking towards a future where we have new kinds of fuels that don't necessarily, well, they can provide air pollution benefits, but not necessarily, right? They also have other emissions. And so I think that points for us kind of in the other direction, that to make sure that we're taking care when introducing, well, when analyzing new fuels, to take into consideration not just the GHGs, but also looking at pollution, so we don't inadvertently create unintended air pollution consequences. And I don't think I think that there's a lot of public interest in addressing air pollution, right? It's something that we can see, particularly in ports. And I know ports in Europe with large cruise terminals, I'm thinking Barcelona, of course, this is a major driver for policy that in many cases will lead to solutions like onshore power. So just skipping the fuel altogether. And I think that has some interesting kind of knock-on effects for decarbonization, because you now have more charging infrastructure, more transmission of electricity into ports. that could unlock then ferries, then tugs, even small feeder vessels for electrification, which is an exciting potential advance for shipping.
Great. So it's part of the bigger picture. I like that. One thing that hasn't been mentioned from any of you, and when we look back to 2020, when we had the global sulfur cap coming into force, was that we saw the uptake of scrubbers on board vessels. None of you had mentioned, Harris, you talked about ultra low sulfur fuel and MGO, and Andreas, you noted the benefits of biofuel, especially the B100 in the Med when it becomes an ECA zone. Do you think the scrubbers will still play an equal important role in the future, or is it was it more of a gap closer between these that we had for 5-10 years, rather than something that we'll see more of in the future? And this is not directed to specifically anyone, but happy to jump in if any of you.
Yep, my answer. To me, the new Med ECA and the upcoming Canadian Arctic, the Norwegian ECA that's coming in 2027, and the Northeast Atlantic ECA, which is yet to be adopted and will probably be in the MEPC of October, are enhancing the opportunity to install scrubbers on board, because now we have more ECA zones worldwide. So potentially, the scrubber utilization will be increased. That's my point of view.
Yeah, I agree. Again, coming back to these price spreads, we're again seeing then an even bigger price spread where there are more savings to be generated on a scrubber. Then, of course, there's some additional requirements to the scrubber quality, such that it can actually scrub down to the low enough. But absolutely, I agree. There's an upside to scrubber, and it's not smaller. Then there's always, of course, when we're talking scrubber, there's also a political risk. I am a risk manager at heart, and there is always the risk that there are some regulations that will put them out of operations again. And with the huge capex required with scrubbers, then of course this is also something to consider. But in general, the economic benefits will increase. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that answer. Moving on to the EU ETS, so the carbon market that we first got introduced to in the industry last year, and we're still to submit the first round of EUAs. We've seen with the current phase-in of the 70% in 2025, and with the current pricing, intra-EU coal will add around 150 to 175 euros per ton of VLSFO consumed today, and next year it will be closer to 250 if we have the same pricing. Do you, Andreas, see that this is affecting the employment of the tonnage in the EU?
The short and good answer is no. So far, the price or the cost related to the EU ETS system is too low. There's not really enough economic punishment, so to say, that actually changes behavior. It's an incentive, but it's not a sufficient incentive. The price is simply too low. We have not seen the influx of more efficient vessels going to EU. We have not seen a dividing of the world into two parts. We are seeing that the costs are being pushed to the end consumer, and not really providing an incentive to actually reduce your emissions per se. There is, of course, an incentive to operate more effectively, I'm trying to say, but in general, the commercial ports, the commercial routes, the trade lanes have not changed. We've not seen a big change to the behavior of the shipping companies, especially not in the dry bulk area, where we see, and the tankers as well, where we see that the client is king, and we have to go from A to B to C to D. There's not really been a change in the behavior of here. But of course, with a lot of other regulations coming into force, that picture might change. But if you're just looking exclusively at EU ETS, there's not been a change yet.
Do you think there's a price point where we will see this affect the employment of tonnage? And if, I mean, of course, there will be at some point if it goes infinite. But do you have any rough guess on what that amount could be? Are we talking double of the price that we are now, or maybe even higher?
I would say, yeah, we're talking at least double. Of course, as you say, there will be a point where it will change. I'm not of the opinion right now, and might be wrong or be contradicted in this, but I'm not in the opinion that we'll see any change in behavior due to EU ETS anytime soon. We have to go far out into the future, and when we go far out into the future, we'll see a lot of interactions with other pieces of legislation, which will create a whole package which will drive changes of behavior. So when we've seen so far, at least in 2024, and also to some part in 2025, where we have more or less EU ETS exclusively, and also due to the phase-in, well, not really any substantial impact. But if we look at 2030, when we see that the FuelEU reduction target is being ramped up, and we see that the EU ETS is fully phased in, then of course now that we see that the penalties for burning fossil fuels are so extreme that that will start to drive behavior. Whether it will drive behavior in the sense that the more operationally effective vessels will go into EU and the less effective vessels will go to the Far East or elsewhere, I'm not so confident about that. I think there will be a new wave, of course, of more efficient vessels that will be great for all of these decarbonization initiatives. But I think much of it will be related to the fuel input more than the actual trading behavior of the said vessels. I think that, as always, wherever the money flows, the vessels will go. And I think that's going to be the case in future. But I think there will be a greater pressure onto the owners to allow for instance, drop-in biofuels or alternative fuels, such that we can continue to operate worldwide without any dividing of the world.
All right. So to you, Joe, I know that the EU ETS is a bigger system and it's not just the shipping that's involved in it. But do you think that given some of the input Andreas just gave, that it's not really affecting behavior, it's just a payment that you will have to do? Do you think that they would be likely to increase the prices by decreasing the supply sooner than what they have set out to? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting point, Andreas, and not surprised to hear that it's not leading to change in fuel. I would have, I guess, imagined maybe some change to where ships are transiting to. So that's an interesting feedback. I do kind of, if I can circle back at some point, I'd like to hear if it is changing for owners, the purchasing, I guess, and the addition of efficiency technologies. But I think so for future ETS prices, it's important to remember that ETS for maritime is not a closed cap and trade. It's not siloed from the rest of ETS. So it is together with heavy industry, aviation, and so on. So decisions will be made across sectors. And they have a pretty ambitious schedule for retiring allowances already in place. I don't think the trend we're seeing politically in Brussels is towards increasing that ambition. However, I also don't see a trend of going back on that ambition. Of course, there has been, through the omnibus package, revision around this CSRD. What I read in the new, the second term of Ursula von der Leyen is more a move towards lowering barriers and lowering administrative burden, rather than lowering the environmental and climate ambitions of the EU. So I think the real question around ETS is, what does ETS look like in a net zero framework world? There's a revision plan for 2027. There's also the clause within the the ETS which says that it will be evaluated in light of any IMO action. And so what will the ETS look like is a big open question right now. There's many versions of what it could look like. So I won't speculate now. But it's maybe interesting or important to note that the two criteria they're going to base that revision on are, one, the double burden. And so that's become the kind of big political point right now, but also the environmental integrity. So if you were to get rid of the ETS, would the IMO match the environmental integrity of the EU ETS? And here, the kind of the corollary between ETS and net zero framework would be the tier 1 or direct. And I know we'll go into that, but there it's not covering the full amount of emissions like ETS. So it's hard to say where it will go. Likely some sort of revision. But I certainly, if I was sitting on the commercial side, I wouldn't be betting on a whole-scale removal of the ETS. In fact, I would probably put my bets that it sticks around.
All right, thanks for that, Joe. Now a follow-up on the revenue generated for the EU ETS. That most of that goes into the innovation fund under the EU, and equally that the EU ETS is a broader system with multiple industries. The innovation fund also covers multiple industries. Have you seen, because you guys work a lot with R&D and methodology for how the shipping is looking like in the future, have you seen this funding actually come back to the industry, and in what degree, and what has this been used for?
Yeah, it's just getting started, so very early days. It is, let's see, is it 2 million allowances? No, 20 million allowances, which equates to around $2 billion per year, will go to the innovation fund earmarked for maritime decarbonization. And exactly how that $2 billion gets spent will be further fleshed out, and also maybe it will go into different buckets. But what we've seen from the innovation fund so far is largely grants given or contracts for difference given to projects that apply. So a more kind of like active subsidy rather than a passive subsidy like we had with the Inflation Reduction Act. So this, though, I think is a really interesting space to watch, because I think that this also aligns with a big EU priority, which is to increase clean fuel production within the EU. And the EU is sitting on quite a bit of funding through the ETS that they now can put towards that use. It also doesn't necessarily have to come from the EU itself. So majority of the ETS revenue gets turned over to the states. And now we have seen France come out and commit to using that funding towards scaling up fuel production. So I would expect that actually in this next year, we start to have a better sense of how and when this ETS funding is going to be turned into subsidies for the scaling up of clean fuel production, which I'll just note is really needed. Even in an IMO net zero framework world, it's not enough unless you're looking, ahead to 2035, 2040. At that point, we'll be good, but we would prefer to have some of these projects come online before the 15 years. We have a lot of companies investing in fuel production that they're ready to go. They just need a solid business case to get off-takers to sign agreements. So, yeah, that's all.
All right, thanks. Joe, you had an interesting point on the double burden of reporting. Speaking of the burden, I think it's appropriate to ask one of the technical managers, Harris, on how much of what is the extra burden that these sort of regulations, and in particular the EU ETS that you have to report via the MRV system, how much extra time have you guys spent on doing these things, and is that something that you are getting better at? I mean, are you getting faster, or is that a continuous issue for you to make sure to report these things in a correct manner?
Yep. As you said, the standard reporting for all the recent years was the MRV and the DCS, and now the ETS report has been integrated in the MRV reporting process. Last year and this year was compliance year. We had to prepare for the first time the company's emission report, which segregates the whole emissions of the fleet that and the vessels that sailed in EU. We had the new administrative burden and responsibilities, as you mentioned, having to manage the MOH account. It's the Maritime Operator Holding Account, which holds the EUAs. And through this MOH account, you have to submit the final emissions data after verification and meet this verification by the compliance date, which was 31 of March. I think the ROs and the companies were not very prepared to meet this deadline and this new reporting scheme. But the pathway was ready because other industries were already under ETS. So at the end of the day, we managed to accomplish all these compliance burdens. But for sure, it was some additional administrative burden. And I can only imagine what's coming with the FuelEU next year, for which the deadline is 31 of January. It's even stricter. There are many, many other requirements in Thetis and in our reports to meet what is required for the proper reporting of FuelEU.
All right, thank you. Then more of a broader questions to all the panelists. The EUA trading has, of course, been burdensome, as Harris just said. It's also something that can be considered a risk, of course, a risk of trading. Do you think that it will continue to be, or is it just a compliance requirement, or is it something that we see being a competitive element in the future? I guess Andreas is probably the best to answer it, but by all means, you can all weigh in on the question.
Well, from my point of view, at least, there is a huge element of this which will be a compliance element, and it will continue as a compliance element. There is, of course, some part where you might say that depending on the clause, of course, that you have with your cargo client, if it's just a allowance transfer clause, then you can try and hedge your exposure, and you can, of course, do that as well if there's a cash transfer instead of an allowance transfer. Of course, subject to your hedging abilities, you might create a small profit, but the exact ability to actually make this into something related to a business element, I think that's going to be very difficult for you. I want to say more or less how creative you are. There's, of course, a whole new industry of voyage optimization programs and companies that can help you on all sorts of things, which is erupting out of nowhere of this regulation. But for, I want to say, a traditional shipping company, there's not much of a business to be done here. There's, of course, a de-risking element, which I'm, of course, also sitting with and doing some of the hedging for these EUA exposures that you have. But in order to transform it into a business venture, I think you have to be a separate company, or at least I don't have the creativity to see how I can make this into a business.
Good to hear. I also think that the EU probably didn't intend to make include the maritime into the EU just to create more risk appetite, but to create a price on the carbon. So I guess somebody will be happy to hear that. Okay, I think we should close the EU ETS segment and move on to, I wouldn't say the elephant in the room because we're talking about it, but it's probably the elephant on our desk these days. And Harris touched upon it, that it will be an increasing difficult requirement to report and with a strict deadline. For the FuelEU Maritime, what has actually been the biggest commercial challenge that you've seen, Andreas?
Where to start? I'm very happy that we already had the experience of the EU ETS once we started actually trying to understand and implement the FuelEU Maritime regulation, because having this start of understanding of emission regulations when we are talking about FuelEU helped create this very, very complex monstrosity or monster of a piece of regulation. Having that understanding already made it more easily comprehensible. Because at least to me, working with both regulations, FuelEU Maritime was much more complex, it was much larger, there's a high degree of uncertainty along the ways. So the biggest commercial headache here was actually trying to take this very technical piece of regulation, try and compress all of this information into a commercial toolbox, something that we can actually go out to our owners and our cargo clients and say, like, this is what this is about. And also at the very heart of it all, create an organizational understanding of what is this regulation about. So me as a risk manager, I'm of course not in the front office, I'm not sitting out talking to clients, but I have a lot of other people who are out there talking to clients. I need to make sure that they understand what they're talking about. I need to make sure that they can actually go out and sell a product, or they can make sure that we're not buying a too expensive product. So creating this commercial understanding of what is this regulation, how can we trade it, what's important to remember, what clauses are there available, what levers can we pull in order to make the correct trades. I think that was a huge headache. And what we're still seeing today is that when we go out to some of our counterparties, whether they are owners or charters or clients, we still are saying sometimes, so this new FuelEU Maritime, and then they stop us. They say, FuelEU Maritime, you mean EU ETS? We're like, no, that's not actually, that was last year. Now we have something different. And especially as we move further and further east, we see this more of an issue, but we're also seeing that as soon as we start actually engaging with them, the first commercial headache or headwind that we're meeting is a bit of reluctance. Oh no, why do we need this? Why is this now coming in? And well, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that, but I have to create a solution for you and to you. So that's really what I mean when these are really the commercial headwinds that we have met. First and foremost, creating this understandable this very large regulation, complex regulation, into something understandable for the in-house chartering teams that can go out and talk to our clients. And then actually when we go out and talk to our counterparties, especially our owners, then like saying, well, also educating them, telling them what is FuelEU, what knowledge we have, and how can they comply with this regulation. Can we in NORDEN, can we help them through our FuelEU compliance pool? Can we get them in, or can we tell them about what is biofuel and how can we actually use this drop-in fuel into your main engines without any, or with very low risk of damage to the engine? So a lot of education has been going on and trying to make people understand what they're actually paying for. And this is, well, the story of my life for the past 2 years.
All right, but Joe, at the center, you don't have you don't feel the burn the same way. This is not something that you guys have to comply, and it's not something that affects your business since you are a non-profit. But I guess you talk to a lot of operators and owners out there. Is that the picture that Andreas paints? Is that something that you see going on broadly?
Yeah, absolutely, and yes, we feel the pain on behalf of the industry out there. I think mostly for us, we started the FuelEU work being really excited about what had passed, because it, unlike as Andreas has described very well, the ETS is good at collecting revenue, maybe some efficiency, but it's not going to drive fuel switching. And so we saw the FuelEU as being this great opportunity. And then when we went out to talk to industry, especially, before people like Andreas got smart about it, it was a lot of blank stares and, oh, I don't know what this is, and certainly not going to make any decisions based on it. And so that really directed a lot of the work that we've been doing to try and, as much as we can, provide clarity, provide tools, analysis. And then we got so frustrated that, at least I did, that my spreadsheet looked very different from another person's spreadsheet, which looked different from another's, and how could we all be getting different numbers if we're looking at the same annexes? And so that we worked with the Commission through the SSF to produce this report. I do think what's interesting, and I'm curious if others have found this, is that it is has been very helpful for IMO discussions, that even though it's a more complex regulation, that companies getting on top of FuelEU has broadened resources, has increased their capacity to then be able to already, before it's even adopted, to start to think strategically about the IMO. So that is one benefit of the pain. But no, certainly, and this is something that, you know, there is uncertainty that's unavoidable, like, you know, which fuel is going to be the cheapest 10 years from now, which alternative fuel. Fuel prices in general are incredibly uncertain. And then there's uncertainty that we can address, and it just takes a bit of elbow grease and getting regulators to be aligned and come out with clarification on the regulations. And so that's where we've been trying to push the kind of avoidable lack of clarity that really can hold back investments. And, you know, I wouldn't spend $1 billion on an expensive e-methanol plant if I wasn't absolutely sure what the emission factor of that plant was going to be, and that I could get that fuel certified, and that the buyers of my fuel would be able to use that and sell it on a compliance market, or the benefits of it. So yes to everything Andreas has said.
And even though I'm the moderator here, I can also pitch in and say, as my work is to help also clients with FuelEU, I can see that many of the clients that I am helping, they had never done biofuel before. They had never even tested it, many of them. And now you actually see them coming back, asking for guidance on how to take it and get the full utilization of that biofuel. So even though it's a nightmare, most likely for Harris to do the reporting on FuelEU, it actually shaped the behavior of the industry towards at least dipping their toes into these new fuels for some of the more advanced ones. So I also agree to what Andreas said.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, what we've also been seeing is that we've been using this new piece of regulation as a toolbox to go out to our owners and say, okay, now we have EUHS, now we have FuelEU Maritime. We need you to be more open to the idea of burning biofuel on your vessels. We have to have the tools available for us to have the lowest cost of compliance. The penalty rates on the FuelEU are massive. They don't make it able to have an efficient operation. They will be very cost heavy, and they will ultimately end on our cargo clients, who are not interested in paying for this if they can escape it. So therefore, we need to engage with the owners, and having this policy lever has been an amazing tool to actually say to our owners, well, on your vessels which are trading EU, for them to be able to trade EU cost effectively, we need to have biofuel available. And at NORDEN, at least, we've had more than 5 or 6 years of experience of biofuel already that we can now actually employ here. And this also sort of comes back to the notion that these new regulations are really an advantage for the larger shipping companies compared to the smaller shipping companies. The larger shipping companies such as NORDEN, we have the back office support functions, we have the experience, we have the teams that can sit down and actually engage with this without interfering with our normal trading behavior and our profit maximization. So having these support functions, these in-house expertise is a huge advantage. And of course, also actually physically out there on the oceans, having a large fleet where we can optimize what vessels can, if we already have a vessel that's going on a voyage past a bunkering hub, a biofuel bunkering hub, then we do not have to have any deviation. We do not have to have any additional waiting time. We already know the bunker suppliers. That's not always the case for the smaller shipping companies, especially if you do not have any biofuel experience. So having that actually quite a large advantage for the larger shipping companies to bring down the cost of compliance compared to the smaller ones. in just the sense that we can operate around it. We will always, in the matter of a year, we will call the biofuel bunkering hubs. That's not given if you have 2 or 3 or 5 vessels that you'll be calling one of these during a year, so that you're able to use your normal operations and your existing experiences and your in-house capabilities and your network of bunker suppliers is a very efficient toolbox to bring down your cost of compliance compared to smaller companies, which actually means that many of the smaller companies, also due to the administrative and technical burden, can potentially be much better off buying the compliance from either a different company or from a marketplace or a different pooling service provider.
That's actually a great point, Andreas. And I'd like to move over to Harris here. It's not like Seamar is a small company, but there's of course a difference to being NORDEN, who's a listed company with 400 ships. Do you recognize some of the hardship or the less advantages about the biofuels, that you have to build that knowledge in a smaller organization? Does that keep you from doing it? You mentioned you already did some biofuel testing. How is it from your side?
Well, from our perspective, the biofuels is a solution, especially in the years to come, as the targets for the intensity gets more demanding every 5 years, both for the FuelEU and the upcoming GFI. But the biofuels do not come with any operational challenges themselves, because from a day-to-day perspective, the most common, the HVO and the FAME, do not create major issues, as we said, especially if they're properly handled. But for us, we see that the supply chain infrastructure is not yet fully ready to support a worldwide biofuel adoption, both for the FuelEU and the upcoming GFI. Now, if you ask me, the FuelEU Maritime, this 2% greenhouse gas intensity reduction over the first 5 years, it's rather low, because the companies only have to purchase and consume small portions of biofuel in order to make the whole fleet compliant. So for me, it's not the case now, but as the years go by, because this is only a temporary constraint. After 2030, 2035, it will be much difficult. And I believe many companies will have a driver of as the biofuels as a choice to comply with all these regulations. Of course, the biofuels comes with another thing as a trick in terms of their consumption, their retention on board, and how they react to cold flow, commingling, as we said before, for the ULSFO. But now it's much more harder because the engine makers recommend to strip down again the fuel tanks. Commingling should be avoided in any case. And we also expect that the biofuels, due to the lower calorific value, are expected to have a higher consumption against the standard fossil fuel, which is not very common when we do the calculations for the FuelEU penalties. I'm not sure if you guys have seen this when you calculate the biofuels, but a biofuel with a lower LCV, as a rule of thumb, will have a higher fuel consumption, which affects, again, the voyage economics and the fuel planning of the vessel. It might be to 3 to 5% more fuel consumption, at least on paper. So this also should be taken into consideration. And not to mention, of course, the documentation part of the biofuels in view of the FuelEU and all these POS requirements, the proof of sustainability. Many times it's not easy to get it before the bunkering, right? So it's hard to assess the GHG compliance in real time.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the long-term trends or some of the consequences of these new regulations is that we have to think in energy. We have to think of fuel more in terms of energy and calorific value rather than metric tons, as has been the the rule of thumb for many years. And of course, we need to adapt when calculating the impact of these different fuel types. So very good point, Harris. I'd like to bridge this now into the IMO GFI. But I want to do it with a takeaway from the FuelEU. So where we had the ETS before, that's mainly a compliance element that we have to monitor, report, and then buy these EUAs, not to risk it, not to try and optimize, but actually just to comply. With the FuelEU, we got this pooling mechanisms, which means that have been created a market for this excess compliance that can now be traded. And I know you're actively doing that in NORDEN for your pool participants. I see some of that logic and some of that methodology being reused in the IMO. Is that something that is going to make it more successful, you think, Joe, when the IMO, if we say that what has been agreed in terms of the overall framework is what we're going to see in October, given that there's no big surprises, but do you see this trading aspect being a key part of the new framework global?
Yes, the trading specifically, right? As a driver, I do. So at one point they were considering not allowing trading at all, and so we were very happy to see trading was allowed. Simply because, well, for a few reasons. One, the reason that Andreas mentioned, that it allows smaller owners to benefit from the ability of larger owners, or larger operators, I should say, being able to purchase sustainable alternatives at potentially lower operational costs. And simply, we want the vessels that are enabled with dual fuel technology to maximize their dual fuel and use as much, whether it's methanol, ammonia, even biogas or e-methane as possible. And the trading allows vessels to earn quite a bit of revenue by selling their surplus credits. So if you think in the first year, it'll be 17%, I believe, is the tier 1. So if you can get emissions reductions down to 90% below, you've got quite a big delta of over-compliance that you can sell in a market. Of course, the question is, what will that price be? We know one thing, which is the price ceiling for the first 2 years, at least, the remedial units of the 380, so it can't go beyond that. Currently, and Andreas and Harris will know more than me, but the pooling in the FuelEU, we're seeing trading upwards of 200, 250, and potentially higher. So maybe we could see something similar. Of course, it's a few years out. A lot could change. But there is a kind of market distortion happening because we have this tier 1 sitting in the middle, which is doing the revenue generation as the ETS does. And so that will likely limit the amount of surplus that is out there on the market, because there will be fewer cases of, say, someone using a B30 and then they've got a nice little bit of delta that they can sell. Likely vessels are going to stay pretty close to that tier 2. And so what that will do in effect is just limit the amount of surplus in the market, and that will, of course, then raise the price of that surplus, which increases the benefits for those going all the way to zero. But it also may limit some emissions reductions that we would like to see. So I think I threw a lot into that answer, but hopefully got to some of what you were looking for.
Yeah, sure. But a small follow-up then, because with the FuelEU, you can actually keep the your compliance for a long time. it doesn't have an expiry date, but the IMO has, I think it's a 2-year expiry for the surplus units that you generate. Do you think that was a needed restriction of the trading? Would you like to have seen the same on the FuelEU, or do you think it's just adding more complexity?
Yeah, I think I think it would have been a good idea in the FuelEU as well, and I think it's a good safeguard. We've seen in other fuel standards from California, and the low carbon fuel standard has really been dragged down for many years by banking of allowances from early on. So that is something that fuel standards suffer from, that because you have these, a pretty high or limited amount of emissions reductions early on, that tends to be when the marginal abatement is the lowest. So you get a lot of abatement and then storing of that, or banking of that abatement, and then you dump it into the market and you keep those prices low. I'm hearing from, I was kind of curious for FuelEU what the behavior would be, whether banking would be preferred, but the limited view that I have on this, not being, of course, a commercial operator, that actually companies seem to be preferring to sell their surplus and to earn the revenue rather than holding on to it. But that is not based on an analysis, and I would be very curious to see, or will be curious to see, after all the reporting is done, how much actually gets banked, because that will, I think, tell us a lot for IMO, and whether they just overcomplicated the measure or actually put in a needed safeguard.
Do you have any comments to that, Andreas?
Yeah, I was just sorry, I was just about to add to it. Yeah, I think you're right in some sense that many of companies actually prefer selling it compared to banking it, and I think there are some reason for it. And I think first and foremost, banking means that you're binding your capital into a future benefit. And most companies, well, you're making the investment now. You also you don't see that you're necessarily getting a larger return on that investment in 1 year or 2 years. And if you think you're actually getting an equally large return on your investment this year, why not then release that capital bound in that banking already? So I think that's really what's driving it. And then I also think that as we come closer and closer to year end and into the verification period, then there's all of this very large puzzle that has to be fit together when shipping companies realize that, oh, there's a penalty coming up because we haven't burned biofuel. Well, the penalty rate is around, 650 euros per ton of CO2. Well, if I can buy it for 400, why not take that reduction? And then, of course, as you say, I mean, yeah, the market is trading somewhere between 200 and 250, 70-ish. So, well, then the question is, is that going to be the trading range as we move closer and closer to the verification and so on? But I think that in general, we see that there are a lot of players, especially from liner companies or some companies using some more, I want to say, even more alternative fuel types, which have a very low cost of compliance. Well, if they can go out and get some of their return on their capital bound, then yeah, I think that's also what I've been observing.
Cool. I'd like to bring Harris in here as well, because he's the one sitting with all the reporting, and with a potential global measure coming on top of these regional measures. Do you think you can utilize some of the knowledge that you have gained from complying with these regulations into a new one, or do you have a big hope? I guess you do, but do you have a big hope in that this will become the single framework that you need to report under? So comparing a little bit the IMO DCS with the EU MRV, doing this 2-tier or double burden reporting, is that something you see as an advantage, or will you crossing your fingers that we will get down to one?
You mean for the upcoming GFI, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Currently, we have the DCS, which more or less will cover the reporting requirements of GFI, which is a global scale. For us, it will add also this additional reporting and verification for sure. Since the backbone of the regulation is the fuel intensity, it really resembles with the FuelEU. So we'll have some additional requirements in terms of reporting to meet the FuelEU requirements, but now on a global scale. So probably DCS will be helpful, but with some additional data in terms of the fuel consumption and fuel in use and BDNs, etc. But I think the complexity does not stop with reporting. The compliance pooling for GFI is completely different compared with FuelEU. We have these two tiers, and at first glance, if you see the figures, it seems that the base target can be easily met, like FuelEU now, at least for the first years, with some portions again of biofuel consumption. Some biofuel blends, by the way, have indeed a straightforward compliance for many years, like the biodiesel B100, for example. B30, for example, is very only for the first couple of years is compliant. Then again falls under the tier 2. So the companies now have to implement a different strategy on the compliance. It does not resemble FuelEU in this term, and but this is another story. We have to also talk about infrastructure, whether it is ready, and the upcoming certified life cycle emissions that are required to support the documentation for the GFI if it's adopted.
All right. Building on that, and as the final of the IMO GFI topic here, do you think we will have two systems, Joe? Do you think there will both be FuelEU, EUHS, and the IMO GFI, or is one of them to be scrapped in the near future?
So I think the Commission themselves doesn't know the answer to that question. So they will likely be definitely waiting until adoption, assuming we get adoption in October, and then potentially also waiting for guidelines, for example, fuel certification, LCA, to evaluate along their criteria of environmental integrity. And then I see three options. I see, the simplest would be a full repeal, although I don't think that would ever apply to the onshore power requirements. I imagine those would stay because they're also linked with the fear, and hard to argue that they overlap with the IMO. And then the other is that it remains in place. And this is just speculation, but I would imagine that they would look to align targets. Otherwise, it would be extremely complicated and part of the regulations. You could imagine the tier 2 or the FuelEU targets aligning with tier 2. And then perhaps for non-compliance, then maybe a discount applied onto your, as Andreas mentioned, the 650. This is all speculation. I could see would be to essentially remove the main part of the FuelEU, the intensity target reductions, and then look towards increasing stringency around other elements such as the RFNBO sub-target and so on, or maybe even something I'm not considering. So, it's hard to say which of those three, and I think it's too early to really speculate. And again, like with the ETS, probably the conservative bet is to not assume that it will just disappear, but some form of it will remain. But I think that, revisions will happen. I think it would be just one thing I've heard is that they won't do anything, and certainly that's an option. But that would just create such a nightmare that it's hard for me to imagine that as one of the pathways. So some revision is highly likely.
So basically what you see is more of an alignment between the regulations rather than a replacement of the regulations, if I hear it correctly.
Yeah, alignment, alternative version, or repeal of the main part. I would say those are the three. And probably equal weight on any of those three possibilities happening.
We will follow up on that when we have a clear picture in 2027 or sometime around that. But until then, we shouldn't get our hopes up to just see things disappear as fast as they came on our desks. We're a little bit stretched for time, so I'd like to move in to the final segment of where the regulation is heading in terms of the regulation here and how they are shaping it. I think we could probably discuss from here on and until 2030 on which fuel type will be the most attractive and which one will be the most financial and safety viable. And I don't think we will be much smarter at the end of such discussion. So let's do an easy question instead and say, when do we think that the industry will hit net zero? Any bets? Do we think it's before 2050 or later, if we have to? I mean, does this regulation scheme, does it do the trick, or do we need a few more years to rely on?
I mean, that's an extremely difficult question to answer. Of course it is. But what we're seeing now, at least, is that with these pieces of legislation coming into force, that there is an increasingly large economical incentive to actually perform towards the net zero target. I mean, that incentive has not been there if we go 5 or 10 years back, but now it's set there. We have a more or less a framework, and of course, depending on the final form of the IMO regulations or the IMO guidelines, then we will see that companies will be forced to go towards that target within that frame, which is set within the regulation. Otherwise, the financial penalties of not doing so will be massive and therefore drive you out of business. So yes, in the sense that if we actually implement these pieces of the legislation and we stick to them, we don't repeal them, all of that, then yes, we will see that we'll reach our targets in that same time frame, at least on the demand side. I'm a bit more curious about what's going to happen on the supply side. Will we be able to create the sufficient supply of these alternative fuels within the correct timeline? Even if the demand side is there, then it will take time for supply side to adjust. And this might actually create a new reality where we say that, okay, this will not be done by 2050, but by 2060 or 2055 or whatever. But if the supply and demand will interact, then absolutely certain we will make it.
And do I see nodding from Joe? Yeah.
Yeah, I like that answer. And I think shipping has a few things going for it. First of all, I was speaking to some California climate regulators, and we often complain, there's 100,000 ships. That's so much. How could we possibly transform the fleet? And they were like, oh, we've got like twice that in just trucks alone, transporting goods in one state. So in some ways, it is a large fleet, and we think of it as large fleet. Compared to other sectors, we actually have a more manageable problem in that sense. And then, I think shipping is kind of like the trees, the Ents in Lord of the Rings, right? Slow to make a decision, but then once the decisions are made, then the power is very strong. I think the net zero framework is historic and has not been seen in any sector. You cannot compare it to CORSIA at ICAO for aviation. It's far beyond, way more ambitious. And so with this regulation, I agree, we are on a path, a really solid path, and yeah, the supply is going to be the big question. But again, the supply is also a function of the demand. So if we can get that demand strong enough, and to me, I feel like we've got now the global market. Now it's, and that's created largely through sticks. Now I'd like to see some more carrots added into the mix, some support for supply, and that will come also through the IMO Net Zero framework, through rewards for zero and near zero fuels, also through ETS funds in the EU, and we're seeing a shift towards industrial policy and the scaling of clean energy globally. So I think it's important to not think of the Net Zero framework as the end of climate action, right? This is maybe the beginning, that the market was created, and now countries can come in and build upon that market by supporting supply, including through development assistance to least developed countries that have great renewable resources that can potentially produce these fuels at very low costs, supporting jobs and economy. That will, of course, rely on support from large institutions like the IMO, World Bank, and so on. So a lot of work to do, but I'm pretty positive.
All right. Do you have anything to add, Harris, before we move to the Q&A?
In terms of the net zero, I think from my perspective, we're quite far from this very ambitious set point. But I think IMO is in the right path with all these new regulations coming into force. Companies will thrive into and try to meet this net zero, or at least the FuelEU and the G5 targets, which are relatively close to net zero. I think we are there. The industry can make it. All
right. And I think what most of you are saying, that it's going to be more of a supply issue than it's going to be a demand issue going forward. And that leads me to the Q&A, where Andrea has written and asked, what's the confidence that biofuel will be available to meet the growing demand that is expected in the future? I guess what you've all been saying now is that this is the big unanswered question. Can we have supply enough to support the change in the short term, for sure? But once we get beyond 2030, do we get enough of the biofuel to the maritime industry? You also have the road transport that needs to have a green transition, and the same with aviation. But any additional thoughts to add to that question?
Just quickly, I think it's important to also distinguish between what kind of biodiesel we're talking about, whether it's biofuel we're talking about, whether it's biodiesel, or if it's biogas, biomethane. And I think the short answer is most forecasts past 2030 see a real supply crunch for real sustainable biodiesel. And so that is why there's this interest in investing in more scalable technologies such as e-fuels and blue fuels, and potentially some other biofuels that are methane or methane based, have less, not to say no, because there's a lot of industries more and more consuming them in just a limited supply by their very nature. So that is true. No way around that.
All right. A second question for you here, Joe. Bernardi asked, with 2 billion euros in 7 years into the innovation fund, corresponding to about 4% of all shipping EUA's revenue, do we have a better view on shares reallocated to member states? So I think the question is mainly how much of the revenue should we expect to go to shipping? I think we touched upon it in the ETS segment, but maybe just a quick recap.
Yeah, so there's 20 million euros allocated to the Innovation Fund specifically for shipping. The remainder goes to member states, and it's under their discretion. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it has to be for climate action. I'm actually not positive that it has to be for shipping climate action. But that doesn't mean that countries can't choose to direct those funds towards shipping decarbonization, just like France has done. And that's something that we advocate for as a great potential resource.
And then Maria has a question stating that based on certain calculations related to CO2 penalties for the vessels, the overall cost of using biofuels appear to be similar or possible even higher compared to conventional fuels. Have you, Andreas, ever experienced a biofuel option that turned out more expensive than paying the FuelEU penalty?
Yeah, I was just sitting and thinking about what the assumptions would be in order to make that equation that biofuel and fossil fuel will be equal, but I don't think I can make it. If I'm using some of the ordinary prices for biofuel B100 and even compare it to the VLSFO where the spread is higher, and also incorporating the EUA saving that we go into there. I mean, what I'm seeing, at least in my calculations, is somewhere between 40 to 50% compared to the penalty, and sometimes even lower if depending on what biofuel you can get and of course what price you can get it at. So I would say at least from my calculations, I cannot really see the same results. I see that there are significant cost reductions of using biofuel for a vessel, especially if you can pool it as well, and then transfer the excess compliance to other vessels.
Yeah, and I would second that notion in my experience. Unless you are taking a really, really low quantity, maybe even by a truck, or you're buying it at a remote location, I usually don't see savings less than 50% of opting for biofuel rather than paying the penalty. But I cannot rule out that there can be some occasions where it's possible to find it more expensively. I think we'll just do one last question before we have the wrap up. Ross here asks, Andreas mentioned that expanding ECAs could lead to greater savings with scrubbers compared to low sulfur fuel. How does that play out given the growing restrictions on open loop scrubbers used in port, plus the extra fuel they consume and potentially carbon penalties for that extra fuel?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Ross, and that's also what I was alluding to with what I call political risk. As you mentioned, these open loop scrubbers are increasingly facing restrictions which can or which will limit the potential upsides to using scrubbers. So I definitely agree with your observation, and it's very correct. So I agree with your comments.
But both you and Harris mentioned that it would be an enhanced option to do scrubbers, especially in the ECA zones. But I guess then that's taking a risk that they don't become banned on the political risk, or you'll have to opt for more closed loop. Yep. I'm a bit novice in this area.
It would be possible to much more rational to consider the closed loop scrubbers in this occasion. Yes, of course, because we have all these restrictions coming for the open loop scrubbers. At the end of the day, we have to calculate the ROIs and consider all these new pathways and the new ECA zones. I think it might be interesting to do the calculations again and run the numbers so we can see after 2027, 2028, what will be the outcome.
Are the closed loop scrubbers more energy requiring than the open loop? Simply, I don't know, so I'm asking.
To be honest, I don't know if they're more, but the core idea is that you don't flush out what comes into the system. Of course, the scrubber comes with an extra consumption, which should be taken into consideration. And of course, the carbon penalties because you consume HFO. So we have to consider everything. and run again the calculations, they probably make sense.
All right, great. I think we end the Q&A here. I would like to thank all three panelists for taking the time and sharing your insights. It was great to have both the technical, the commercial, and the policy elements in this discussion. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did, and hopefully the audience as well, of course. If there are three key takeaways that I will bring with me from today, is that the supertanker of shipping is slowly changing direction towards net zero. Hopefully we will stay on that course, and hopefully we will get there by 2050. The second takeaway is that the regulation has shaped behavior already. We've seen that across the board. So it will be more of a question whether the supply can actually live up to the demand that we hopefully will see increasing with this new regulation. And then the final and the one that I feared would probably be the most negative element of this discussion was the increased reporting of having multiple systems. But with the experience already gained from the EU MRV, the EU ETS, the FuelEU, and the IMO DCS, it appears that the shipping industry will actually be able to handle it. We just need to get better and sharper in calculating the opportunities out there in terms of the fuels, and we'll have to make some long-term decisions in terms of what fuels to use, what type of vessels do we need to have a net zero future. Is there anything that you would like to add to these takeaways, any of you?
I think that was a very great sum up of the things that we've discussed, and I agree with your points. There's a lot to be done, and we're working on it, but at least to me, the important thing is that now it also makes economical sense to drive this decarbonization, and that is, in the end, what I believe is going to drive behavior or changes to behavior. So yeah, I just also want to say thank you for listening in, and thanks for the panelists, and thank you, Stefan, for moderating this panel discussion. It's been great to participate.
Thank you, Andreas. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thanks for spending the time on a Thursday afternoon. I hope you learned something. I think we all got some new insights that we can use going forward. So yeah, happy to see you out there. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can probably find us on LinkedIn or write to the organizers. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Stefan.
Thank you.
Thanks.